Ladies and gentlemen.
Yes.
This is Mr. Tony Prince.
No.
Yeah.
Buongiorno. Buongiorno. Thank you, guys.
Tony, we're going to sit.
Hey?
The stage is yours.
Oh, thank you. Can we have a round of applause for our organisers, ladies and gentlemen? Thank you, guys. We'll see you a lot.
Thank you, Tony.
Oh, good. Welcome. I'm so pleased to talk to you today.
No, you're going to have to wait a second. Just for those of you who don't know Tony Prince is really the beginnings of pop music radio as we know it across the world.
You're going to take my script away from me now.
Yes, I am, because I just read it. And I just need to introduce him that he is actually the president of our advisory board. And he was from the very beginning with us, as was Scott Cohen, who's sitting over here. These are luminaries in the world of music and radio, and it's because of them, of course, that we were able to establish our credentials and make the progress we have. So I want to thank you from the bottom of our heart, also to you, Scott, and all our other advisory board members for helping us and supporting us. Oh, and Gordon Mack, of course, the second pirate from the 80s, the first pirate from the 60s. I'm going to go now.
Thank you from the heart of your bottom.
Thank you.
Yes, as I was saying, I'm so pleased to talk to you today and see a lot of old friends from recent years and new friends. And it's a giant stride for the event to be here in Italy, a dynamic country for radio. My company, DMC, has been providing DJs around the world with exclusive music, mixes, remixes, mega mixes, jams, all kinds of music on a regular monthly basis for 33 years. It gave DJs something that their audience, their public, couldn't buy. They had to listen to their radio station to hear these mixes, whether it was the Michael Jackson mega mix, Madonna mega mix, or a remix of some great new track we're enjoying. DMC gave DJs the cutting edge, and we still do it today. So, I originally started out in life as a singer-guitarist with a band. I joined a big band, and then the British Musicians Union threw me out because I was playing records when the band had their break, and they didn't like that. They didn't like records. I'll tell you more about that later. I then became a full-time DJ and stopped being a singer. A lot of people were very happy about that, I can tell you. I then joined the pirate ship Radio Caroline. You've all seen The Boat That Rocked, or Pirate Radio as it's called in America. And after that, when the pirates ended, I spent 16 great years with Radio Luxembourg. 9 of them living in Luxembourg, 7 of them in London as program director. I recently completed a 12-part film documentary called The History of DJ for our website, dmcworld.com. And some of you may have already seen it, and we're going to play some excerpts from it today. And I hope to show you the rocky road music radio has traveled. And I'll introduce you to some of its enemies. Providing you understand that radio has had lots of enemies over the years, people who tried to stop its growth. To start, I want to say that you might not be celebrating our great radio industry here today. None of us might be here if it hadn't been for one of the great Italian inventors, and I do mean the man who's already been mentioned a moment ago. He was born not far from here in Bologna, Guglielmo Marconi. Why don't we give Marconi a round of applause? Now, there is no doubt that radio's greatest friend has been music. Even that was a rocky relationship. But come with me now to my record library and we'll explore the history of radio.
Music's been around a real long time. It's been around maybe since we were cavemen. What a great gift music has been. But you know what? Radio hasn't been around that long at all. In actual fact, radio has only been on the planet for just over 100 years. That's not a very long time, is it? If you think about it. 100 years. What an incredible success story radio has had. Can you imagine a world with no DJs?
The time now is 11 o'clock British Summer Time, midnight Central European Time. The makers of Stay Blonde and Brunatec shampoos bring you Europe's #1 pop music program, Radio Luxembourg's Top 20.
No radio, no top 20. That's what it was like once. There were no records to make a top 20. They hadn't invented records. They hadn't invented record players or tape recorders. Music was something you went to see performed live. You saw it in parlours being played on pianos, in taverns by ceilidh bands with flutes and violins. And you saw it in music halls, like this one in Canterbury. This was in 1856. Yes, music was a live thing. We seem to have come full circle now, don't we? Can't make a lot of money out of records these days, so you make your money doing live gigs.
Okay, let's go back 100 years now, right to the beginning, and meet Marconi.
Marconi, at the age of 20, invented his spark transmitter with antenna at his home in Bologna, Italy. Taking this amazing black box through customs in the UK, the customs officers were a little suspicious and started breaking up the box. Marconi had said it was an implement that made sound travel through the air. About as crazy an idea as man's dreams to fly back then. In June 1896, the young Italian filed for British patent number 12039 and began to build an empire of Marconi companies. Here was the Bill Gates of his day and age, who invented radar long before cars were on the road. But the event Marconi will best be remembered for came 5 years later when he was resident in Great Britain, when in December 1901 he made his very first live broadcast from Cornwall to Newfoundland using balloons to take his antenna higher.
His invention came just in time to help communication during the First World War. But by the Second World War, radios were in every home in the world.
Germany calling. Germany calling.
Just as Lord Haw-Haw was becoming Hitler's #1 DJ with his Nazi propaganda, 127 million records a year were being sold in America alone. Gracie Fields Day had finally arrived.
By the way, I've got to say, Lord Haw-Haw was an Irish guy called William Joyce, and he's the only DJ I know in history who was executed for his programs. That's what we did with him after the war, executed him, off with his head. I know a few DJs who should have been executed, but he's the only one who was. How did Marconi's invention grow from soldiers communicating in the First World War to its position of popularity between those two world wars? What happened? How did that soldier in a trench communicating with his captain, how did they bring that into the end of the war? And how did civilization adopt radio? Where did the radios come from? There was no such thing after the war. They were all little things with headphones. Let's find out.
In 1922, a radio transmitter powers up ready to make history. Nearby sits Arthur Burrows, and with the words,
"Do hello, Marconi House, London, calling."
Burrows announces the arrival of the BBC. The age of British broadcasting has truly begun. But wait a minute, how did this moment ever happen? To start a radio station, you need people to have radios. But who has a radio before there's a radio station? High above the mud of Flanders in 1918 float disembodied voices. The First World War is the crucible for a new technology, sending speech by radio. When the fighting is done, a small but loyal army of enthusiasts comes home. They're a new breed, radio hams, a kind of virtual community scattered across the country, in living rooms, garden sheds, anywhere they can get a signal with their homemade sets. Then the Marconi Company gets involved, At the heart of their team is the irrepressible Peter Eckersley. He soon tires of sending repetitive test signals to see how far they go and starts livening things up a bit, telling jokes, singing songs. The hams love it. But the post office, who control the airwaves, aren't amused by such frivolous content interfering with more serious uses. In 1920, they ban the station. After a barrage of complaints, the post office is forced to relent, but on one condition. Radio needs to be regulated. They bring electrical firms together to create a new entity, the British Broadcasting Company. They alone are granted the right to broadcast radio to the masses. They'll be powered by Britain's biggest transmitter yet, 2LO, an enormous jumble of valves and wires that takes up an entire room. And on a foggy night in 1922, 2LO comes to life. With 1.5 kilowatts of power, it can throw the voice of Arthur Burrows right across London. Soon, his voice is joined by others in a medley of news, weather, and even music. And it's not just hams tuning in. Young and old, male and female, rich and poor. Radios span the social spectrum, fast becoming must-have household goods. And so it is that the hobby of a few enthusiasts is standardised and nationalised. When the next World War comes around, it's announced to the nation on BBC Radio and heard by 9 million listeners. And that's how the information age came into the home.
So you've now met radio's first real enemy, the British government, who wanted to control it and make money from it with the license fees that everybody who had a radio in Britain had to pay. So they were an enemy to radio's development. It was just one radio station, the unholy alliance, the monopoly of the BBC. Johnny Beeling was head of BBC Radio 1 for a number of years. He's a friend of mine, and we had a conversation about it one day.
You have to go back to the influence of World War II on the BBC. It changed enormously because there had been only the home programme, and then they started a forces programme during the war, which was much lighter in its appeal. And out of that grew the light programme in 1946. So by then we'd got a situation where you had three. You had the home service, the light programme, and the third programme. The third programme was very straight.
When you say very straight, classical music?
Yes, and serious drama, I believe.
Lord Reed, can I just say, I got the impression that he was a bit of a dour man. He was brought up in a church environment, and he imposed his own desires for what he felt was a radio desire for the country. Is that about right?
Incredibly straight. It was called the British Broadcasting Company originally, I believe, when he first founded it, and he was the chairman and was a very strict disciplinarian, wouldn't tolerate any mucking about, nothing like the sort of things we hear about these days.
Absolutely not.
Certainly not. You weren't even allowed to work there, I think, if you'd been divorced or anything like that.
He's probably turning over in his grave as we speak.
I'm sure.
Everything that was uttered on the BBC was from a script. There was no ad-libbing. Everything was read by the announcer. That's quite extraordinary. But even more extraordinary, whenever you heard the news, you didn't realise that the guy at the BBC reading the news had an evening suit on with a dicky bow. He was all dressed up to read the news. That was just the strange policy introduced by Lord Reith, the Director General. Now, this man Reith had to deal with other enemies of radio. Newspaper publishers, why should they be an enemy? Well, you know what? They were threatened. They thought radio was going to kill their newspapers. They thought the BBC was going to bring news to the people before they could. They were frightened to death. So a deal was struck to keep them happy. The BBC promised they will never, ever give any news out after 7 p.m. at night. So if the king had died at 7:30 p.m. at night in England, we wouldn't have found out until 6 a.m. the following morning. But that was the way it was. The son of a minister, Reith, dedicated Sundays exclusively to religion, to keep the religious people happy, because they thought with religion on the radio, people wouldn't come to church anymore. Why would they? But he kept them happy with religious programs, and he got the churches involved in those programs. So He didn't have a worry. He could do what he wanted. He had a monopoly, and he didn't have to worry about getting commercial sponsorship or anything like that we do today. The public were forced to pay for the BBC.
Within 3 years, the British government made its move to control the medium with the introduction of the 1904 Telegraphy Act. From that day forth, everyone with a radio or a receiver had to have a license. The BBC was now on the horizon.
This is the BBC Light programme. Here is the news.
I want to introduce you now to a guy called Gary Brown. He was a trombone player with the Johnny Dankworth Orchestra. When I first met him, he was the controller of dance music on the top-rank ballroom circuit. He had about 100 venues around Britain, and he had to put the big bands in there, and I was taken on as a singer-guitarist with a big band and went down to Bristol in the West Country. Gary asked me to start playing the records when the band had a break. He paid me a couple of quid extra for doing that, so I was working all night. Musicians' Union secretary came to see the band to make sure we'd all got the right deal with Gary's company Top Rank. When he came to me, he said, "Hold on a minute, you're working all night, aren't you?" I said, "Yes, I am, 6 nights a week, and Saturday mornings, and Saturday afternoons, and Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday, and Friday lunchtimes, 2-hour session." I was working pretty hard, and he said, "You should get more money." I said, "Well, thank you very much indeed." 2 weeks later, this same guy wrote me a letter. "It's been brought to my attention that you are breaking union rules. Keep music live. We do not want records in ballrooms because they're putting musicians out of work." Extraordinary. Anyway, this guy Gary Brown, who you're going to meet now, he eventually came with me to the Musicians Union branch meeting in Bristol, where I put my case forward. I said, "You really should keep DJs in the Musicians Union because we are musicians. We love music. You don't have to play a guitar or a piano to be a musician. It's up here. And if you keep DJs in the union, you can then control how much music they play, and everybody will be happy." But they didn't listen. I was expelled from the union. And if this very day I want to rejoin the Musicians Union, which I don't, I have to pay them £50 fine. That's true. Anyway, here's Gary now. We talked about the arrival of rock and roll, which swept away the big bands of the world. Rock and roll, come on!
I want to talk about the audience and the Birdland and all the dancing they did, you know, because that's where your career finally came, to the audience. It's down to how do we pack a dance hall? They come to dance. In the days you just talked about, they came to watch. And that's understandable because the music was incredible. But there was all kinds of dancing crazes going on, weren't there?
Oh yeah, well that came through because of the American troops.
Yeah.
That were over in England.
Yeah.
That's where the jitterbugging and all that really started.
And that was like the big brother, if you like, of the jive, which became rock and roll
jive, yeah.
when Bill Haley came along.
Well, Saturday night and I just got paid. Got the money, don't try to save.
I've been in the music business, I guess, from birth, but probably my most influential period when I first got into music was in 1957 when I first heard Bill Haley and the Comets, and I went to see them. And I was 12 years of age. So then I had an interest in music. I collected music. I bought records. I collected records. I played in little bands when I was 15. I did talent shows when I was 16. I did working men's clubs when I was 16. And when I was 17, I decided this was too hard. So it was this start of the DJ. So I became a DJ.
You know, there were no jobs for DJs in those days he's talking about. Yeah, the BBC had very limited broadcasters. I don't think they even called them DJs at that point. So people like Tilly Rutherford and myself and other kids in Europe had to become DJs in dance halls and clubs, which was fine. But here's the question. Where and when did that word disc jockey come from? Who coined the word DJ? You might have guessed where it came from.
In 1935, American commentator Walter Winchell coined the term disc jockey as a description of radio announcer Martin Block with his show Make Believe Ballroom.
This
make-believe ballroom time. We are a sweet romance. Here's your make-believe ballroom. Come on, children, let's dance, let's dance.
I steer assiduously clear of television. For some reason or other, I still like just the microphone. I don't like the camera that goes with it. You know why I don't like the camera? Slow walk. Because I claim that television, for some reason or other, spoils a person's ability to use their imagination. And when we lose our imagination and the use of it, I think we're losing something very important in our lives.
You see, there's another enemy for radio. We had television to face us now, and he's recognizing it, and he's saying he doesn't like television. Radio's completely different. What wise words. Never lose your imagination. It's what makes a DJ a great DJ. In America, we now listen to some of the superstars who are riding this incredible wave.
Hey, Cousins, here on Sirius 6, Cousin we see live from New York City.
Todd with radio for the musically impaired.
Well, that's it for me, my little angels. I will see you next time.
The Beatle Paul may be dead.
This is Tom Donahue, and that's all for tonight.
The next stop is Vietnam.
I'm Allison Steele, the Nightbird.
Murray the Kid, Sock and the T, and as the fifth Beatle.
Hey, Kimosabi.
This is Arnie Woo-Woo Ginsburg.
And this is Dick Beyond the
E to the young. Ho, this is John.
Blues this new song.
Well, that's all right.
Home free here. The station is WINS.
Hi there. Welcome to the History of DJ. We continue in this episode by tipping our hat to our rock and roll cousin DJs in America, the guys who set up the teenage revolution. Ready for Elvis.
It was unusual to see the name Elvis, because the first time I saw that name on a jukebox, my initial reaction, what the hell is Elvis? And I found out very soon.
But first, they had to get rid of the formats of the 40s. The music was finished. We were ready to rock and roll.
Only in America, how can a kid without a cent, how get a break and maybe grow up to be president?
My papa's hair was turning white, 'cause he didn't like rock and roll. He said, you can stay, boy, but that's gotta go.
Come on, let's play some more.
Most sickening thing I've seen in a long time is the marquee of one of our prominent movie theaters showing the picture called Blackboard Jungle, called The Bold Story of the Teenage Terror. There are good and bad among all ages and all groups of people, but it's certainly a shame to single out the teenagers in this country and make everybody look at them just because they're a teenager. It happens to be a sin.
Teenagers began to like black music.
Our music was Frankie Lyman. Little Richard.
Alan Freed. Rock and roll is a river of music which has absorbed many streams. Rhythm and blues, jazz, ragtime, cowboy songs, country songs, folk songs, all have contributed greatly to the big beat.
And here we go to rockin'. Here we go.
They're really rocking in Boston and Pittsburgh, PA, deep in the heart of Texas and round the Frisco Bay, all over St. Louis and down in New Orleans. All the cats wanna dance with sweet little 16.
Being a disc jockey back in the 50s was fun because we had something that began to save radio.
Hello, Mr. Radio, your friendly speaker.
At a congressional hearing in America, Alan Freed was made to be a scapegoat for the payola scandal. Payola, here we go again. The record companies are an enemy. What are they doing? They're going in to meet DJs. They're giving them money. They're giving them drugs. They're taking them to Las Vegas with the hookers. They're giving them anything they want to play their music. It was called payola. The government heard about it, moved on it, and poor old Alan Freed, the guy who coined the word rock and roll, died from payola. God bless his soul. Now then, music starvation. Where do we go from here?
No one can underestimate the powerful influence of the American DJs in the 50s. And while the kids across Europe and United Kingdom were starved of pop music, apart from Radio Luxembourg and AFN, the BBC were having none of it. In America, the DJs started on local stations, built their reputation, the word spread, a bigger market would employ them, and they'd keep moving until they hit the Big Apple. And then they'd find themselves working on different radio stations. And the great thing about America was there were lots of radio stations. You didn't need to be out of work for too long.
So why was the BBC so terrible? Okay, it was one channel. But why was it so terrible? And why did it make Radio Luxembourg so fantastic, even with all its static at night, on the medium wave, on AM? Now let's talk about the BBC's enemy number one. And this has really been the big enemy. It's what caused pirate radio. It was the restriction of music and how much the BBC were allowed to play. It was called needle time restrictions.
Can you imagine the day and age before cars, when the planet relied on horses, when fields were filled with horses and there were stables everywhere and people went from one place to another in posh carriages? All those people, the farmers, the horse trainers, the people in carriages, relied on horses for their livelihood. Can you imagine what would have happened if they'd had a union when the cars came out who said to them, you do not ride those cars, you stay where you are on those horses, or else you will ruin our industry? I wonder how long it would have taken for cars to come through then. The reason I'm giving you that thought is because in the 60s, we ran into the Musicians' Union. Now, here was a powerful body who controlled radio, dance halls, everything, because we needed live musicians in those days. It was before records came into our lives. If it was anything to do with the Musicians' Union, these shelves filled with records would not be filled with records. They'd be barren. Now, when records arrived, just like the cars arrived, the Musicians' Union were powerful enough to say to the dance halls, you can't play records in these dance halls, and to the BBC, Britain's only radio station, you can't play too many records, maybe half an hour a day. They were in control because they wanted to save the jobs, protect the work of musicians. Good. We love musicians. They make records. Subsequently, a thing called needle time restrictions came into our lives. And for a long time, it ruined our lives. Or let's put it this way. It stopped DJs from evolving.
One station that never suffered from needle time restrictions was good old Radio Luxembourg 208, the station of the stars. And the reason it didn't was because it was in Europe. It wasn't anything to do with British licensing. And it just got on with it. And it was like an oasis in our life. We'd all listen every night. We'd go to sleep under the pillow, listening with a little earplug, and we'd wake up and it had gone off air and all you'd hear was static. But what Radio Luxembourg did do that we didn't realize when we were teenagers, it used to sell airtime to record companies, the old enemy. So the programs were 30 minutes of EMI, 1 hour with Decca, and so on and so forth. Now, what would that create? It would create a record company cramming in as many of their records as they could, the good, the bad, and the downright awful. But we didn't realize they were awful in those days. We were all pretty naive, and Radio Luxembourg was pretty bloody wonderful. But that selling airtime to record labels ended after the pirate radio incursion.
Here's a very reasonable question. All we want to know is...
Everyone in this photo was a Radio Luxembourg DJ, gathered here for the Stuart Henry Multiple Sclerosis Appeal.
Look with your ears. Violet, indigo,
Kid Jensen,
blue,
Paul Burnett,
green,
silly
yellow,
bugger.
orange.
We went back to the station.
Red.
Kid never knew how to use a microphone.
Radio Luxembourg.
Paul Edmonds.
The colours of the rainbow before your very ears.
RTL Villa Louvini. The city of Luxembourg, where so many DJs lived for so many years. What a great radio station it was, and what fun we had. The first radio station to play Elvis Presley in Europe. First station in the world to play the Beatles' Love Me Do. 208, your station of the stars.
Your station of the stars, broadcasting on 208 meters.
Voice of Barry Aldis.
In the days before rock and roll.
This is Van Morrison.
In the days before rock and roll.
Night and day, you are the one.
In the days before rock and roll. In the days before rock and roll. It's your friendly station, great 208.
Radio Luxembourg is to stop broadcasting to Britain on medium wave after 58 years. It was the first pop station to be heard here, but recently it's been hit by falling advertising revenue and lower audience figures.
In the days before rock and roll.
Now, our last report tonight comes from, I will endeavour to find it, it comes from this proud and independent little country. Its position between Germany and France and the Low Countries puts it at a sort of European crossroads.
When I was a kid at school, I did not have any idea that Luxembourg was a little country. It wasn't until much, much later. Much later. I mean, I think I'd probably already started making records when I suddenly realized that Luxembourg is not just a radio station. It's not just like tuning into the local station. It's a place. I didn't realize it was a place as such. I just thought it was a couple of rooms with DJs in it.
This is Radio Luxembourg, your station of the stars, broadcasting on 208 meters medium wave. It's time for Top 20. Hi, everybody. This is your DJ BA, Barry Aldis, at the microphone. It's great to be with you again.
The makers of Stay Blonde and Brunatec shampoos bring you Europe's #1 pop music program, Radio Luxembourg's Top 20.
Everybody used to wait for 10 o'clock on Sunday night to hear the top 20 with Barry Aldis and Keith Fordyce and Paul Burnett over the years. It was fantastic. Radio Luxembourg's transmitter on the medium wave was 1,400,000 watts. 1440 kilohertz was 208. You used to send it up into the ionosphere. The signal would bounce down in Scotland. Now, if you took a compass from Luxembourg to Scotland and ran it round in a circle, you could see how big Radio Luxembourg came down here to Italy. It went over the Iron Curtain into Czechoslovakia. I met a guy in Czechoslovakia who lived and breathed Radio Luxembourg. He first heard the Beatles on Radio Luxembourg, and you know, it was 10 years before he knew which one was John, Paul, George and Ringo, because the communist newspapers never put a picture of the Beatles in his paper. Luxembourg was a life-saving device for teenagers, but especially for those in the Iron Curtain. But now, the BBC and Radio Luxembourg were about to have a wake-up call. I'd like to introduce you to Richard Park, who employed me on Capital Gold for a while. He started his broadcasting career on Radio Scotland, a pirate station up in the north. He now is the boss of Global Radio in the UK, one of the most powerful men in radio.
Inevitably, a chance to make money mixed in with a chance to really entertain people. In the sexy world of rock and roll in the 60s, when, you know, the bands emerging out of the UK were going on to dominate the world. You know, Beatles, Stones, I mean, even Herman's Hermits, the Hollies, these sort of bands. Everything was massive. The country was agog with it.
1, 2, 3, 4. There's a kind of hush.
And the fact that we couldn't have it as a normal service, the government had to tell us what was good for us and what wasn't, I still find an anathema.
Here is the Midnight News.
And this is Alvar Liddell.
For nearly 40 years, the BBC ruled the airways with little or no competition. But then in the mid-60s, something happened which would change the way we listen to music forever. Pirate radio. It challenged the BBC's monopoly. The government tried to shut them down but couldn't, as they operated out to sea in international waters. Several pirate ships were launched. Probably the most famous was Radio Caroline.
I spent 2 wonderful years on Radio Caroline learning the art of broadcasting. We'd never had anywhere we could go and learn before this, and here we were on a ship with a bunch of Canadians, Australians, Americans who all came from radio countries, and they taught us the art. It was 2 weeks on board the ship and 1 week off the ship. They used to give us a crate of beer each and free cigarettes. The wages, €30 a week. Honest. And then we'd have a week off and go to London and spend our €90. Life was wonderful. We loved the pirate stations.
Oh, we love the pirate stations. We love the pirate stations. We love the pirate stations. Don't let them take them away. Don't let them take them away. There's some swinging DJs playing top 40 records. They can really turn you on. Now the government's trying to close down the stations. What'll happen when they're gone? You won't hear the music that you like any old time of day or night.
Next time on The History of DJ, the pirate period. The pirate ships are coming. One of the most exciting parts of being in Britain in the 60s.
The man now known as the godfather of pirate radio is Ronan O'Reilly. Ronan is back home in Dublin now. He's quite poorly. His memory's gone, and it's not good news. But he was a really important person in all our lives, no question about it. One of the first DJs to work for Ronan on Radio Caroline was a guy called Roger Gale. Now, I've spoke with Roger, and this interview was conducted in the Houses of Parliament. Why? Because he's now Sir Roger Gale, MP.
Ronan O'Reilly didn't instigate pirate broadcasting. Offshore radio began in Sweden. It may even have begun in Australia, but it certainly began in Sweden because Caroline South, the Mi Amigo, was bought in. Radio Atlanta, which was actually the very first station, and people forget that too. Atlanta was on air before Caroline. And Atlanta was the ship that had been broadcasting from offshore into Sweden. So it wasn't Ronan O'Reilly's idea.
There can be no copyright on this idea. I mean, there have been 11 commercial radio stations on ships before. And it's idiotic to think that it's any single person's idea. It's not an invention. This is a fact. What happens is that Ronan took this fact and put it into operation.
They were cowboys. They were Wild West. They were having a good time. And they wanted to be part of something special. All of them were interesting people.
Caroline's beginning was as a direct result of me managing an artist called Georgie Fame, and at the time, and both EMI and Decca turned him down, and the only alternative was to start a label. But in order to start a label, you had to have a radio station to promote it, and then I kept getting back to a radio station, and that was the motivation for doing it.
Ronan couldn't get Georgie Fame played on the BBC, so he made an appointment to go to 38 Hertford Street and meet the big boss of Radio Luxembourg, Geoffrey Everett, who himself had been a radio DJ out in Luxembourg in the 40s. So Geoffrey sat there behind his big desk, and in comes Ronan with his little record, and Geoffrey explains to dumbfounded Ronan O'Reilly that he can't play the record because all the programs on Radio Luxembourg are sponsored by record labels, and if your record isn't with a major record label who sponsor a show, it's never going to get played. So Ronan's leaving the room, and he turns round to Geoffrey and he says, "Well, I guess there's only one thing I can do. I'd better start my own radio station." Geoffrey said, "Yeah, well, good luck with that, mate." Ronan walked out the door, and the rest is history.
We play
Georgie Fame.
Lights down, low solar, now can't see. We gotta do that, we gotta do that, yeah, yeah. We gotta do that, we gotta do that.
And do that he did. Ronan O'Reilly's father owned a shipyard in Sleepy Greenore, Southern Ireland. A real advantage for him once he'd purchased his ship Fredericia in Holland. The locals looked on in wonder as the enormous mast was erected onto the ship, soon to be relaunched and renamed Radio Caroline. Music publisher Alan Crawford had revealed his own plans to start a pirate radio ship to Ronan.
Alan Crawford, the Australian who started what became Radio Caroline South, Radio Atlanta. Another oddball. I think you wouldn't do something like this if you didn't have some sort of a screw loose somewhere.
I felt that the BBC monopoly was far too severe a handicap, so of course being an Australian I wanted to change it.
This second boat, Radio Atlanta, had been the original Radio Sid pirate ship broadcasting to Sweden. Crawford was persuaded by the wily Irishman to rig out his vessel in his father's shipyard.
I couldn't find another port in which to fit out my ship, the Mi Amigo, and had to be using his father's port as originally agreed. And we were tied up against his ship, which was bigger, and all the time getting a kind of Irish mafia treatment of things disappearing and so on. You could never put your finger on who was doing what, but we were being delayed all the time. I mean, a comedy in a way.
Eventually, Alan Crawford did a deal with Ronan O'Reilly. Ronan took over the ship. That gave Ronan 2 ships. So he sailed one round the coast right up to the Isle of Man in the north of England, and he had Radio Caroline South and Radio Caroline North, Britain's first network.
Here we are, upstream on the River Thames. About 30 miles down there, you come to the Thames Estuary just past London, Houses of Parliament and all that. And in the Thames Estuary, the forts, which were built to fight away the Germans during the war, were used by people like Screaming Lord Sutch as radio stations. The forts, not just the boats, were pirate operations. Very exciting in the mid-60s. And this is the river that took you down there, past the forts, and you come to where Radio Caroline and Radio London put their anchors down and broadcast for a couple of years. 3 miles outside the international fishing limits, so that there was nothing illegal about what they were doing. Until, of course, the British government brought in the Marine Offences Act. Now, I mentioned Radio London. This radio ship was Tony Blackburn's favourite. He started on Radio Caroline, did the breakfast show, was extremely popular, and then one day he jumped ship. And here's the man who persuaded him to jump ship, Alan Keane, who was the programme boss back in the day, later to become my boss at Radio Luxembourg. Let's go meet Alan Keane.
Wonderful Big L, wonderful Radio London. This is wonderful Radio London, where you're hearing things, where you're hearing things.
Well, Alan, people might argue about this, but I think you were in charge of the 2 best radio stations Britain's ever known. What do you
I had
say
the best
to that?
people.
Yeah, do you think that was the reason?
And that includes you. Those were the
first
days.
time I ever heard of you, Alan, was when you were running Radio London, the pirate ship. What was life like before the pirates for you? How did it all come about?
My introduction to radio was through a man called Philip Birch. And Philip was the man that launched Radio London. He was an account executive with J. Walter Thompson, one of the biggest advertising agencies in the world. And he was based in New York and Detroit. And his function was to, as a media buyer, place the advertising throughout the whole of the States for the Ford Motor Company. Now, he actually heard what was going on in England with Radio Caroline and decided to launch a ship in competition with Radio Caroline, which was doing comparatively well at the time, appealing to young people.
This is Radio Caroline on 199 meters, your all-day music station,
Britain's first commercial radio station.
We got on the phone to a number of old friends, and everybody coughed up some money, and off we went, and it started from there.
He left JWT, came to London, and put together a team.
Was this around 65?
64.
64.
In the August of 1964. London didn't go on the air until the December of the same year. And so he put together a consortium, a group of people, which incidentally included the wife of the president, Lady Bird Johnson. Now, we never disclosed that.
Lyndon Johnson's wife?
Yes, indeed.
How much did she put in, Alan? The American viewers would like to know this.
Well, we never exposed that.
What we didn't know, and I didn't find out until I wrote my second novel 20 years later, called All Night Long, and I had to research the pirates. But Radio London was very well backed financially. And when I looked into it, I found out who was actually owning Radio London, and it was Marine Investments Incorporated, out of a post office box in Grand Bahama, which is, still didn't bother me too much until I looked into it a bit more, and I found out they also ran Sunshine Radio out of Florida, broadcasting to Cuba in Spanish. Who owns that company? Apparently a little outfit called the CIA.
They broadcast from a ship propaganda for the American government, and the principle is the same.
And of course, when you think about it, the geopolitical message they wanted to get across in 1965, 6, and 7 was no United States of Europe.
August the 16th, 1967, was the day the British government introduced the Marine and Broadcasting Offences Act. This is how they stopped the pirates. The law said, if you are a British subject, you can't work on a pirate station. If you're a British company, you can't advertise with a station. If you provide provisions, you can't provide provisions to a pirate ship unless it's an emergency. And that was it. The end. Radio Caroline continued for a few years here and there through Holland, but it was all over really. The pirate days led to the BBC completely changing its policy, installing a live team of young DJs, all former pirate broadcasters. The Light programme became Radio 1. Radio Luxembourg also sent 5 DJs to live and broadcast live from the Grand Duchy from 7:30 p.m. to 3 a.m., and I was one of that team. Eventually, Luxembourg dropped the sponsored record programs, and the station's popularity grew across Greater Europe until the late 80s. By this time, the Musicians' Union had lost its grip on the BBC, and the Conservative government introduced local radio, independent local radio, to the United Kingdom. Here to close are a bunch of my mates. We went back to Luxembourg to try to recapture some of the magic we all felt about the station, and we all completed a really great ambition to sing in the town's centre Plasdam bandstand. Go on, boys. Whoa, I think you've gone back. You missed one. Hold it. We've already seen this, baby. We've already seen this one. Just kill it. Doesn't matter. I was going to have the boys singing in the Plasdam. That's missing, but it was... There's a radio station that we think is great, and the place on the dial is 208. All the DJs are friendly, and we know... Here we go. We found it. That's called ad-libbing.
That we think is great, and the place on the dial is 208. All the DJs are friendly, and we know them by name, and to entertain the world is their only aim. They call it Radio Luxembourg, Radio Lux. They call it Radio Luxembourg, Radio Luxembourg, Radio Luxembourg, Radio Luxembourg, Radio Luxembourg.
Radio today is alive and well. Thank you. Radio today is alive and well and faces the challenges of internet, satellite, and the many sources people can now go to for their favorite music in the modern era. There are great challenges ahead, but we'll be discussing that this afternoon, and you've got to hear what Gordon Mack's theories are. It looks great. If you'd like to see the full 12-part documentary, just go Google History of DJ. It should show you where it is. It's on dmcworld.com. I did go on a bit. I hope I've given you a really great view of the history of radio. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you.